Utilitarianism, the doctrine that an action is right insofar as it promotes happiness and that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the guiding principle of conduct. This video will investigate the concept of utilitarianism and what its impacts would be on society if it were to be adopted on a day-to-day basis. Where did utilitarianism come from? The earliest concepts of utilitarianism can be dated back to Epicurus' time, somewhere between 341 BC to 270 BC. Epicurus was known as a hedonist due to believing that the greatest purpose in life was to maximize happiness. The reason that he is known for having the earliest, or indeed one of the earliest, concepts of what would become utilitarianism is that while his goal in life was to maximize happiness, it was never just for himself. Rather, he believed that in order to maximize happiness, he must try to maximize happiness for both himself and the majority of people around him. He was the founder of Epicureanism, a highly influential school of philosophy in which helped to create some of the earliest utilitarians. However, it was over 2,000 years later, in 1748, that the founding father of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, was born. Bentham, whose first career was as a jurist, later became a very well-known and respected philosopher, best known for his theory of utilitarianism. He got the idea for what would become utilitarianism as we know it from a book called De Deliti e del Pene, of Crimes and Punishment, written in 1764 by the Italian author Cesare Beccaria. He also got his famous quote, "The greatest happiness for the greatest number," from that same book. Though strongly in favour of the extension of individual legal rights, he opposed the idea of natural law and natural rights, both of which are considered divine or God-given in origin, calling them nonsense upon stilts. To avoid paying the church for his burial, he opted to get himself taxidermied and put on display at the University College London. What is utilitarianism? Now that we know the origins of utilitarianism, let's look at what it actually is. Utilitarianism has two common forms: rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism is to focus on the best rule of conduct. This can be done by looking at the consequences of following certain rules or actions, such as always stop at a red light. The rule with the least amount of consequences and the most amount of overall benefit or happiness will be deemed as the correct rule to follow. Act utilitarianism, on the other hand, is a lot more straightforward. Act utilitarianism will focus on the action of a single person and how their action affects the people around them, including people in the future. With act utilitarianism, you'll focus on how your action or decision affects you and the people around you, rather than how the action of a group of people will affect others if they are to choose the action every time. An example of act utilitarianism would be Plato's dialogues, which bring, even to this day, pleasure and displeasure to students studying philosophy. How and when would you use utilitarianism? We can use utilitarianism for every decision we make, whether it's choosing between buying a gift for your friend or donating to charity, choosing to stop at the next red light or to continue driving. All you have to do is think about what the consequences are and which decision would lead to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. For example, if you were to choose between gifting some money to your children or to your local school, utilitarianism would suggest that you donate to the school because they'll be generating the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Another example would be if you are a politician and you are overlooking a set of new laws to put in place. You would use utilitarianism to decide which law would bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number when followed by everyone. How often is utilitarianism being used in today's society?
There are quite a few examples. Right, say for example there are professional footballers who play in Europe and England and places like that, and what they do with their money, because they are on such ridiculous wages, is they actually generate it back to a fund to help the place where they've come from. Say for example Sadio Mane, who plays for Liverpool, he's actually constructed a school and a hospital in the area that he came from. Right? So you could argue that's easily utilitarianism.
Another example of utilitarianism could be in business. Take Air New Zealand for instance. Air New Zealand has three separate classes: economy, premium economy, and business premier, otherwise known as first class. These three classes offer a range of experiences for your flight, with the most expensive business premier having the most to offer. Because of all these classes offering seats at different prices, almost anyone can afford to take a flight somewhere. This is a fantastic example of utilitarianism, as Air New Zealand is giving the majority of people the maximum amount of happiness they can provide. What are some advantages and disadvantages of utilitarianism? The wrong answers objection comes about due to utilitarianism only focusing on the majority of people. According to critics, only ever focusing on making the majority happy is morally wrong. One common example for this objection is the doctors. If a doctor were to be in charge of 5 severely sick people and 1 healthy person with a simple cold, for the sake of this example he can be called Oliver, if the doctor were to be faced with the choice of stopping Oliver's cold and sending him on his way, or to kill Oliver and take his organs which the 5 other patients desperately need in order to stay alive. If the doctor was a utilitarian, then he would choose to kill Oliver as it would be the morally right thing to do and would provide the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Critics argue this is completely and utterly wrong, as why should the doctor get to decide whether or not Oliver lives or dies? The second objection, undermining trust. This objection is linked to the previous one in the way that if doctors were to be allowed to make these decisions, no one would be able to trust them, and the distrust would not just be with doctors, it would be with judges, firemen, police officers, and even with each other. For how could we trust each other with the knowledge that at any point they might break their promise or turn on us if we were to cause more happiness for the greater number of people? The third objection, partiality and too demanding. This objection arises because of how if one were to go out and buy something for someone or a group of people one knows and cares about, they would first have to decide whether or not they should donate that money to charity, and in doing so raise the happiness of more people than if they were to buy the present and give it to the person or people they know. This then leads into the too demanding category, as if you to have to think of this and do whichever maximizes happiness every single time, you would almost always have to choose to donate to charity rather than buy things for your close family and friends. This then becomes far too demanding, as how can we be expected to always, every single time, donate money to charity rather than buying our siblings, parents, grandparents and friends things for their birthday or Christmas? Now that we've discussed a few of the disadvantages of utilitarianism, let's take a look at a few of the advantages. The most common advantages of utilitarianism would be that utilitarianism is easy to understand, it is flexible and able to adapt to different situations, and its main goal is to bring happiness to the majority of people. Utilitarianism is easy to understand because of its simple construct. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that whichever option generates the greatest happiness for the greatest number is always the correct and morally right decision. Utilitarianism is flexible in that an action could be both right and wrong depending on the circumstances. An example of this would be best described by using the fictional character Robin Hood. As we all know, he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. What we also know is that stealing from people is against the law. However, when Robin Hood was stealing from the rich, he was not stealing for himself. Rather, he was stealing for the poor, and in doing so he was generating the greatest happiness for the greatest number, hence his actions being morally right. The third advantage to utilitarianism would be because its main goal is to always generate happiness for the greatest number of people, and so will stop selfishness from pestering the minds of humanity. Now that we know the basics of utilitarianism, we are finally ready to answer our fertile question: how might utilitarianism impact our society?
It would be incredibly beneficial for most. Right, because I think that what it would do is it would encourage people as a whole to think about their influence on others. Right, there has been profound research which has shown there, William, that the societies that take more care about others are the ones that have a greatest level of happiness, and quite often those countries are the ones that are not so capitalist in their view. Right, say for example countries like Norway and Finland, they have a system based on taxation to create it for taking the tax away from some people to make it a more equitable society. So it's the idea of utilitarianism being better for the whole group in society rather than for certain individuals. Those countries that focus more on a capitalist approach, like the United States, they went way lower in the level of happiness. Right? So those countries that have a more utilitarian approach to taxation and sharing resources are generally the happier.
This documentary has explored the concept of utilitarianism and examples of how its application would impact society. I believe that utilitarianism would greatly increase happiness for the majority of our society. It is an ethic based on kindness and consideration of others. By applying utilitarianism into society, we will stop selfishness and power-driven actions, while simultaneously boosting the overall happiness and effectiveness of our society.